world watched in shock. Sheikh Hasina, the Iron Lady of Bangladesh, was gone. Her 15-year reign ended abruptly in a firestorm of protests. Her resignation sent shockwaves through the nation. The streets of Dhaka became battlegrounds, the air was thick with tear gas and burning tires. Once a leader of economic growth, she was now seen as a dictator. Hasina's fall from grace was swift and brutal. The seeds of discontent had been sown long before the protests erupted. Student groups, often the vanguard of political change, were the first to raise their voices. They saw their futures slipping away, strangled by corruption and a lack of opportunities. The spark that lit the fuse was a seemingly innocuous issue: quotas in the civil service. But it quickly became a symbol of a much deeper malaise. The students took to the streets, their youthful energy a stark contrast to the aging elite they accused of hijacking their future. They demanded an end to corruption, better jobs, and a fairer society. But their pleas were met with silence, then disdain, and finally, brute force. Hasina's government, once lauded for its progressive policies, responded with an iron fist. Peaceful demonstrations were met with tear gas and water cannons. Arrests were made, and a climate of fear descended upon the country. The crackdown only served to further enrage the protesters. What began as a student movement quickly morphed into a nationwide uprising, uniting people from all walks of life against a common enemy, a government they felt had betrayed their trust. Looming over the chaos was the specter of the Bangladeshi military, a powerful force with a history of intervening in politics. Its silence in the early days of the protests was deafening. Or was it already orchestrating events behind the scenes? Whatever the truth, the military's role in Hasina's downfall remains shrouded in mystery. As the crisis in Bangladesh deepened, the international community watched with growing concern. Foreign governments issued carefully worded statements urging restraint and dialogue, but behind the diplomatic platitudes, a more complex game was afoot. Bangladesh had become a pawn in a larger geopolitical struggle between the United States and China. Both superpowers saw the South Asian nation as a strategic prize, its location on the Bay of Bengal and its growing economy making it a key player in the region. The United States, wary of China's growing influence, had long courted Hasina, seeing her as a bulwark against Beijing's ambitions. But Hasina, always a shrewd operator, had refused to be drawn into any one camp, playing both sides to her advantage. This balancing act had become increasingly difficult as tensions between Washington and Beijing escalated. The United States, frustrated by Hasina's refusal to toe the line, began to see her as a liability. China, meanwhile, sensed an opportunity to strengthen its hand in the region. The stage was set for a dangerous game of brinkmanship, with Bangladesh caught in the crossfire. The protests and the violence that followed exposed deep fissures in Bangladeshi society. The country was sharply divided along political, religious, and socio-economic lines. Hasina's Awami League, with its roots in the country's secular liberation struggle, drew its support from the urban elite and the rural poor. Her main rival, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, led by Khaleda Zia, appealed to a more conservative base, drawing on religious sentiment and nationalist rhetoric. The rivalry between the two women, both from powerful political dynasties, had dominated Bangladeshi politics for decades. Their bitter feud, often punctuated by violence and accusations of rigging, had poisoned the political well, making compromise and consensus all but impossible. The protests, fueled by anger and frustration, threatened to tip the country into chaos. The specter of civil unrest loomed large, raising fears of a return to the dark days of military coups and political assassinations that had plagued Bangladesh's early history. With Hasina's resignation, Bangladesh stood at a crossroads. The future was uncertain, fraught with danger and opportunity in equal measure. The country was in uncharted territory, facing a transition of power amidst a climate of fear and suspicion. The international community, eager to avoid a meltdown in a strategically important nation, urged calm and restraint. Calls for dialogue and reconciliation rang hollow in the streets of Dhaka, where the wounds of division ran deep. The question on everyone's mind was whether Bangladesh could break free from its cycle of violence and instability and forge a new path towards a more democratic and prosperous future. Amidst the uncertainty, there was also a glimmer of hope. The protests, for all their chaos and violence, had demonstrated the power of the people. A new generation, raised on the ideals of democracy and human rights, had found its voice. They had shown that they were no longer willing to accept the status quo, that they demanded a better future for themselves and their country. As the dust settled on the ruins of Hasina's rule, whispers began to circulate, whispers of unseen hands guiding events from the shadows. Some pointed to the CIA, long rumored to be active in Bangladeshi politics. They alleged that the Americans, unhappy with Hasina's growing ties to China, had seen an opportunity to replace her with a more pliable leader. Others claimed that China, eager to protect its strategic interests in the region, had provided covert support to pro-Hasina factions seeking to maintain its influence in Dhaka. The truth, as always, was murky, a tangled web of allegations, denials, and half-truths. What was clear was that Bangladesh had become a battleground in a new great game, a struggle for influence between the world's two superpowers. The country's strategic location, its growing economy, and its large population made it a prize worth fighting for. And so, the CIA and China, locked in a global rivalry, found themselves on opposite sides of the Bangladeshi power struggle. Section 8. The Price of Power. Hasina's policies backfire. While external forces undoubtedly played a role in Hasina's downfall, her own policies also contributed to her demise. Her pursuit of economic growth, while laudable, had come at a cost. Critics accused her of favoring cronies, silencing dissent, and turning a blind eye to corruption. Her government's crackdown on journalists and human rights activists had tarnished Bangladesh's image abroad. Her decision to amend the constitution to allow for a third consecutive term as prime minister, widely seen as a power grab, had further alienated her from her people. The irony was that many of the policies that had fueled the protests, the economic liberalization, the infrastructure development, the poverty reduction, had been implemented by Hasina herself. In her zeal to transform Bangladesh into an economic powerhouse, she had neglected the very people she claimed to represent. She had forgotten that economic progress without political freedom rings hollow. Section 9. The Final Hours. Hasina's Defiance and Despair. As the protests raged outside her window, Sheikh Hasina retreated into the fortified compound of her official residence. The woman who had faced down coups and assassination attempts with steely resolve was now a prisoner in her own home. Her inner circle, once unwavering in their loyalty, began to crumble. Some, sensing the end was near, quietly made their escape, seeking refuge abroad. Others, blinded by fear or ambition, plotted their next move, eager to curry favor with whoever emerged victorious. In her final hours in power, Hasina was a study in contrasts. There were flashes of the old defiance, the steely glint in her eye as she vowed to crush her enemies. But there were also moments of despair, of resignation, as she realized that the game was up. When the end came, it was swift and unceremonious. A delegation of senior military officers, their faces grim, arrived at her residence to inform her that she could no longer guarantee her safety. They urged her to resign for the good of the nation. Section 10. The Aftermath. Bangladesh in the Balance. Sheikh Hasina's resignation plunged Bangladesh into a period of profound uncertainty. An interim government composed of technocrats and respected figures from civil society was sworn in to steer the country towards fresh elections. But the challenges ahead were daunting. The country was deeply polarized, the wounds of division still raw. The military, its power enhanced by the crisis, loomed large over the political landscape. The international community, anxious to avoid a humanitarian disaster, poured in aid and offered words of encouragement. The future of Bangladesh hung in the balance. Would the country descend into chaos and violence as it had so many times before, or could it seize this opportunity to break free from its troubled past and build a more just and democratic society? The answer to that question lay in the hands of the Bangladeshi people. They had shown their courage and determination in overthrowing a dictator. Now, they had to summon the wisdom and restraint to build a better future. Section 11. A future uncertain, challenges and opportunities await. Bangladesh stood at a crossroads, facing a future fraught with both peril and promise. The country was still reeling from the aftershocks of Sheikh Hasina's sudden downfall. The challenges ahead were daunting, but so too were the opportunities. The most immediate challenge was to restore stability and order. The interim government faced the unenviable task of healing a divided nation. The specter of violence still loomed large. Extremist groups were eager to exploit the chaos. The international community was watching closely. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, there was also hope. Bangladesh had a young and vibrant population, eager for change. The country had made remarkable progress in recent decades. The challenge now was to build on these gains. Bangladesh had a chance to become a model for other developing nations. But to achieve that dream, it would need to summon all its reserves of courage, wisdom, and